No one interrupted at first. That was the routine. Amara Johnson had learned very quickly that a busy restaurant was not a place where people stepped into other people's problems. Customers came for food, laughter, and quiet luxury. The staff came to work, and whatever happened in between was expected to disappear behind a professional smile. Amara moved between tables with quiet precision, balancing trays and memorizing orders, while the evening crowd filled the room with conversation and clinking glasses. She had been doing this long enough to understand the rules that were never written down. Serve quickly. Smile politely. Ignore what isn't your place to challenge. Especially when the customers are wealthy. Especially when the manager is watching. She kept her voice steady, her posture calm, and her expression carefully neutral. It was easier that way. Attention in places like this rarely made things better. The restaurant pulsed with its usual rhythm. Soft jazz floated through the air. Waiters crossed the floor with rehearsed efficiency. Expensive suits leaned over candlelit tables discussing deals and investments. To everyone else in the room, it was another elegant evening. To Amara, it was another shift she needed to survive. What she didn't know was that someone had already begun paying attention. Not the manager, who avoided confrontation. Not the customers pretending not to notice. Someone else. At a quiet table near the back of the restaurant sat Kang Min-Jae. He had arrived alone, taken a seat where the room was visible from every angle, and spent most of the evening saying very little. His presence carried the kind of stillness that made people instinctively lower their voices when passing nearby. Most people saw a composed businessman. Few people understood who he really was. Min-Jae watched the room the way other people studied balance sheets, patiently, precisely. And eventually, his attention settled on Amara. Not because she demanded attention, but because she tried so carefully to avoid it. He noticed the way she approached one particular table with controlled calm. The subtle pause before she spoke. The way her shoulders remained steady even when the men seated there laughed too loudly. He noticed something else too. Restraint. The kind that comes from enduring something longer than anyone should have to. The other customers saw a waitress doing her job. Min-Jae saw a woman calculating every movement. And then the atmosphere shifted. One of the men at the table reached out. Not to take the menu, but to grab her arm. The restaurant reacted slowly. Some people looked away. Others pretended not to notice. But Min-Jae didn't hesitate. His chair moved back before anyone fully understood what was happening. And by the time the man at the table realized someone was approaching, Kang Min-Jae was already standing between them. The entire restaurant went quiet. Because when a man like Kang Min-Jae decides to step into a situation, the outcome is no longer uncertain. And in that moment, Amara Johnson realized something she had not felt in a very long time. Someone had finally seen what everyone else ignored. And once a man like Kang Min-Jae notices something, he does not allow it to continue. What followed that night would change far more than a single shift in a restaurant. It would change Amara's entire life. Morning arrived quietly in the small apartment Amara Johnson rented above a laundromat on the edge of the city. The machines downstairs had already begun their steady rhythm, low mechanical hums that vibrated faintly through the floorboards. It was a sound most people would find irritating. To Amara, it was just another part of the background. She had learned long ago that life was easier when you stopped fighting the noise around you. Her alarm rang at 6. She was already awake. Amara lay still for a moment, staring at the pale light filtering through the thin curtains. Morning always felt like a brief pause before the day began demanding things from her again. Then she swung her feet onto the floor and stood. Her movements were careful, economical. No wasted motion. She had built her mornings into a routine that required almost no thought. Coffee first. Shower second. Uniform laid neatly across the back of a chair. Black slacks. White shirt. Dark apron. Clothes that made her blend into the background of every room she entered. The bus ride to the restaurant took 20 minutes. Amara spent most of it watching the city wake up through the fogged window. Office workers scrolling through their phones. Construction crews gathering on street corners. Delivery trucks rattling down narrow streets. Everyone moving toward another day. By the time she stepped into the restaurant kitchen, The air already smelled like coffee, butter, and bread warming in the ovens. The morning shift manager barely looked up when she walked in. "Morning." "Morning," Amara replied. No conversation followed. That was normal. Amara tied her apron and stepped onto the dining floor just as the first customers began to arrive. The restaurant was quiet at this hour, sunlight spilling across polished tables, chairs neatly aligned, glasses catching the light. For a few peaceful minutes, the room felt almost calm. But Amara knew how quickly that calm could disappear. By noon the place would be loud, demanding, full of people who believed a server existed somewhere between invisible and disposable. She had seen every version of it. The impatient snapping of fingers, the careless insults disguised as jokes, the quiet assumption that her time, and sometimes her dignity, belonged to whoever sat at the table. Amara had developed her own method for surviving it. Keep your voice steady. Keep your smile polite. And never give anyone a reason to notice you longer than necessary. It wasn't fear that guided her. It was experience. People rarely apologized when they crossed a line with someone they thought was beneath them. Complaining rarely changed anything either. In restaurants like this, management had one simple rule. Customers stayed. Staff adjusted. So Amara adjusted. She memorized orders quickly, delivered plates efficiently, and moved through the dining room like part of the furniture, present when needed, gone the moment the job was done. Some nights, she could finish an entire shift without anyone remembering her face. Those were the good nights. But there were other nights. Nights when certain tables grew louder. When alcohol loosened manners. When someone decided the quiet waitress was an easy target. On those nights, Amara relied on the same strategy she always had. Endure. Finish the shift. Walk away. It had worked for years. At least until the night someone finally decided to step in. By evening, the restaurant was no longer quiet. The soft morning light had given way to warm lamps and flickering candles. Conversations layered over one another until the room hummed with a steady, restless energy. Glasses clinked. Silverware tapped against plates. Laughter rose from certain tables, louder than it needed to be. Dinner service had begun. Amara moved through the crowd with the same quiet rhythm she used every night. Orders balanced carefully on a tray, her steps measured, her attention split between a dozen small details. Which table needed refills? Which kitchen order was delayed? Which customer looked impatient? It wasn't just about serving food. It was about reading people. The job demanded it. Some customers were easy. They spoke politely, thanked her when she refilled their glasses, and left without leaving a mark on the evening. Others were different. They watched too closely. Their smiles lingered too long. Their voices carried the kind of casual authority that expected immediate obedience. Amara had learned to recognize those tables the moment she approached them. And she had learned the unspoken rule that came with them. The customer was always right. Even when they weren't. Especially when they weren't. Once, early in her first year at the restaurant, she had made the mistake of speaking up when a man snapped his fingers at her like she was calling a dog. The manager had taken her aside afterward. Not angry, just tired. "You don't challenge guests," he'd said quietly. "It's bad for business." Amara had nodded. Not because she agreed, but because she understood. Restaurants like this didn't operate on fairness. They operated on reputation. Wealthy customers meant large bills. Large bills meant success. And success rarely paused to consider how the staff felt. So Amara adapted. When someone made a comment that crossed a line, she smiled politely and redirected the conversation. When a joke carried an edge meant to embarrass her, she pretended not to hear it. And when a customer's hand lingered just a second too long while passing her a menu, she stepped back without making a scene. Silence was part of the uniform, just like the apron. Around her, the dining room continued its performance of elegance. Bottles of expensive wine were opened. Plates of carefully arranged food moved from kitchen to table. The staff glided between conversations as if the entire evening had been choreographed. Most customers never saw the tension beneath it. They didn't notice the quick glances between servers when a difficult table arrived. They didn't hear the quiet warnings exchanged near the kitchen door. Table 12's already drunk. Watch table 7. Just get through the night. Amara heard all of it. And like everyone else on the floor, she carried on. Because the job didn't reward confrontation. It rewarded endurance. Most nights, that endurance was enough to get through the shift. Most nights, the problems stayed small enough to ignore. But every once in a while, a table appeared that refused to stay small. And when that happened, silence became harder to maintain. The table arrived just after 8. For men in expensive suits, loud before they even reached their seats. Their voices carried across the dining room with the easy confidence of people who were used to being the center of attention. Amara noticed them the moment the host led them to their table. Experience had trained her to notice certain things quickly. The looseness in their posture. The way they spoke over each other. The sharp scent of expensive cologne mixed with alcohol that had likely started long before they arrived. A table like that could go one of two ways. Either they would eat, drink, and leave quickly. Or they would stay long enough to become a problem. Amara approached with her usual calm smile. Good evening. My name is Amara. I'll be taking care of your table tonight. One of the men leaned back in his chair, looking her up and down in a way that had nothing to do with the menu. Well, that's already the best service we've had tonight, he said. The others laughed. Amara kept her expression steady. Can I start you with something to drink? The man closest to her tapped his glass against the table. Whiskey. The expensive one. 4 of them, another added. She nodded and turned toward the bar. Behind her, their laughter continued. The first round arrived quickly. Then another. And another. By the time Amara returned with their food, the table had grown louder. Their conversation spilled across the room, full of half-finished stories and exaggerated jokes that seemed to entertain them far more than anyone else nearby. Each time she approached the table, the comments became more personal. Where are you from? You work here every night? Must get boring serving people like us. Amara answered politely when necessary and redirected the conversation back to the food whenever she could. But the questions kept coming. One of the men leaned forward as she placed a plate in front of him. You ever think about doing something better than this? Another laughed. Yeah. A girl like you shouldn't be wasting time carrying plates. Amara stepped back, maintaining the same calm distance she always kept. It's my job, she said simply. The answer only seemed to amuse them more. From across the dining room, a few people had begun to notice the table. Some glanced over briefly before returning to their conversations. No one intervened. Amara continued doing what she had always done. Serve the food. Refill the drinks. Move on to the next table. But each time she tried to step away, one of them found another reason to call her back. Mississippi. Waitress. Hey, we need something. More ice. Another bottle. A different plate. Small requests that kept pulling her back to the same table. It wasn't the work that bothered her. It was the feeling that the requests weren't really about the service anymore. They were about control. Amara delivered another round of drinks and turned to leave. Hold on. The voice came from the man at the end of the table. She paused. What else can I get for you? She asked. He leaned forward slightly, a slow smile forming on his face. Oh, we'll think of something. The other men chuckled. Amara felt the familiar tension settle quietly into her shoulders. This was no longer just another table. This was a table that had decided she wasn't finished yet. And the night was only getting started. At the far end of the restaurant, away from the louder tables and the steady traffic of servers, Kang Min-Jae sat alone. His table was positioned near the wall, where the lighting softened and the view of the room widened. From there he could see almost everything: the front entrance, the bar, the long row of tables stretching toward the windows. Most people who glanced in his direction assumed he was just another quiet guest finishing dinner. That assumption suited him perfectly. A single glass of dark wine rested near his hand, untouched for several minutes. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but his attention moved carefully across the room. Min-Jae had always watched people this way. Not quickly. Not obviously. Patiently. It was a habit that had followed him through boardrooms, private negotiations, and crowded rooms like this one. While others focused on conversation or business, he paid attention to smaller things. How someone stood when they thought no one was looking. How a voice changed when authority entered the room. How tension moved through a space long before anyone spoke about it. Tonight, his attention had settled on the same place more than once. Table 14. And the waitress assigned to it. Amara Johnson. He had noticed her earlier in the evening when she moved across the dining floor with quiet efficiency. There was something deliberate about the way she worked. Her steps were smooth, her posture controlled, her expression calm even when the room grew louder. She moved the way people did when they understood how easily attention could become a problem. Min-Jae recognized that kind of awareness immediately. It wasn't weakness. It was discipline. From his seat, he watched as she approached the group of men again. Their laughter carried through the restaurant, louder than necessary, their movements loose with the careless confidence of people who believed the room belonged to them. Min-Jae observed the exchange without shifting his posture. He saw the way one of the men leaned too close when speaking, the way another tapped his fingers against the table as if summoning her. And he noticed something else. Amara never raised her voice. She answered calmly, placed the glasses on the table, stepped back just far enough to maintain distance. But each time she turned to leave, one of them called her back again. A request. A comment. A joke that stretched a little too long. Most people in the restaurant had already decided it wasn't their concern. Some glanced toward the table briefly before returning to their meals. Others avoided looking altogether.
It was easier that way.
Problems that didn't belong to you were easier to ignore. Min-Jae didn't ignore them. He watched Amara pause beside the table once more, her shoulders steady, her voice polite. He watched the men lean toward her with growing boldness. And he noticed the subtle change in the air that passed through the room when tension began to settle quietly into a space. Most people would not recognize that shift. But Min-Jae had spent his life reading rooms far more dangerous than this one. He lifted his glass slowly, eyes still resting on the table across the floor. Something was unfolding there. Not loudly. Not yet. But the pattern was becoming clear. And Kang Min-Jae had never been a man who ignored patterns once he saw them. By the time the restaurant reached its busiest hour, the room had grown louder. Conversations overlapped across the tables, glasses clinked against polished wood, and the steady rhythm of dinner service moved like a carefully rehearsed performance. Servers crossed the floor in quick, practiced paths. Orders moved in and out of the kitchen. The entire evening unfolded with the quiet efficiency expected from a place like this. But at table 14, the rhythm had begun to slip. Amara approached again with another bottle of whiskey balanced carefully on her tray. The men had already finished 2 rounds. Their voices carried across the room now, louder and less controlled. She placed the bottle on the table and began filling their glasses. "Looks like we've got our favorite waitress back," one of them said, leaning forward in his chair. The others chuckled. Amara kept her attention on the glasses. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said evenly. She had already begun to turn away when the voice came again. Wait. It wasn't the word that stopped her. It was the tone. Amara paused, turning back toward the table. "Yes, sir?" The man at the end of the table leaned back in his chair, studying her in a way that made the moment stretch longer than it should have. "You're leaving already? I have other tables to attend to." Another man laughed. "Relax. We're your best customers tonight." Amara kept her expression neutral. "Is there something else I can bring you?" For a moment, none of them answered. They simply watched her. Then the man closest to her reached out. His hand closed around her wrist. The movement was casual, almost careless. But the sudden pressure stopped her completely. "Don't rush off," he said, smiling as if the gesture were harmless. "We're still talking." The room didn't fall silent. Conversations continued. A waiter passed behind her carrying a tray of plates. Someone at another table burst into laughter at a joke she couldn't hear. But inside the small space around table 14, the air shifted. Amara's body went still. Not from fear. From calculation. She had been in moments like this before. Moments where raising her voice could turn a situation worse instead of better. Slowly, she tried to pull her arm back. "Sir," she said calmly, "please let go." The man didn't move. Instead, he tightened his grip slightly, his smile widening as if the situation amused him. "Why so serious?" he said. Across the table, the others watched with relaxed curiosity, their glasses still in their hands. Amara's eyes flickered briefly across the room. The manager stood near the bar speaking with another guest. Two nearby tables had clearly noticed what was happening. Neither moved. The man leaned closer. "You're being rude now," he murmured. Amara felt the familiar tension rise quietly in her chest. One wrong reaction could turn this into something far more difficult to control. She took a slow breath. "Sir," she repeated, her voice steady, "please let go of my arm."
For a moment, nothing changed.
Then somewhere across the restaurant, a chair moved sharply against the floor, and the balance of the room shifted. The sound of the chair sliding across the floor cut through the restaurant more sharply than it should have. Not loud enough to stop the music. Not dramatic enough to silence the room. But close enough. Amara felt it before she saw it. The subtle shift in attention that travels through a crowded space when something unexpected begins to happen. The man holding her wrist didn't notice at first. His focus remained on her, his grip firm enough to keep her from stepping away. "You're being difficult," he said, amusement lingering in his voice. Amara didn't answer. She was watching the movement behind him. A tall figure had risen from a table across the room. Kang Min-Jae walked with a quiet confidence of someone who did not hurry because nothing in the room had the power to stop him. His steps were measured, unhurried, each one carrying him steadily across the dining floor. A few nearby conversations faded as people noticed him passing. Not because he demanded attention, because something about his presence seemed to draw it naturally. By the time the man at the table realized someone was approaching, Min-Jae had already reached them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply stopped beside Amara. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Min-Jae's gaze moved first to the hand gripping her wrist, then slowly to the man holding it. "Let go," he said. The words were calm, quiet, but there was something in the tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could. The man blinked, clearly surprised by the interruption. "Excuse me," he said. Min-Jae didn't repeat himself. He simply stood there, his presence settling over the table like a sudden drop in pressure. The other men shifted slightly in their seats now, their earlier confidence softening as they looked at the stranger, who had stepped into their space without hesitation. Amara felt the man's grip loosen. Not completely, but enough. Min-Jae's gaze never left him. "You've had enough of her attention tonight," he said evenly. The man gave a short laugh, though the sound lacked the certainty it had moments earlier. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" For the first time, Min-Jae's eyes moved across the rest of the table. He studied each of them briefly, the way someone evaluates a situation before deciding whether it deserves further effort. Then he looked back at the man still holding Amara's arm. "You're finished here," he said. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Something about the way he said them left no room for negotiation. For a moment, the man hesitated. Then slowly his fingers opened. Amara stepped back immediately, the sudden freedom in her arm sending a faint pulse of relief through her chest. Min-Jae shifted slightly, placing himself between her and the table without even appearing to think about it. The men looked up at him now with a new kind of attention. Not curiosity, recognition. Because men like them spent enough time in powerful circles to recognize when they had just encountered someone whose authority ran deeper than their own. And Kang Min-Jae was not a man who stepped into a situation unless he intended to control how it ended. For several seconds, no one at the table moved. The laughter that had filled the space earlier had disappeared, replaced by a quiet tension that spread slowly across the room. Conversations at nearby tables had softened, curious eyes drifting toward the scene without openly staring. Min-Jae remained exactly where he stood.
Calm.
Still. His posture carried no visible threat, yet the space around him seemed to tighten, as if the room itself understood that the situation had shifted. The man who had grabbed Amara's arm leaned back in his chair, studying him more carefully now. Up close, Min-Jae didn't look like someone who belonged in a loud confrontation. His suit was dark and perfectly tailored, his expression controlled, almost distant. There was nothing exaggerated about him. But men who lived in powerful circles recognized certain things instinctively. Confidence that did not seek approval. Authority that did not explain itself. The man at the table narrowed his eyes. "You think you can just walk over here, and—" He stopped mid-sentence, because someone behind him had quietly spoken his name. One of the other men at the table had gone very still. His gaze had shifted past Min-Jae for only a moment, then returned with a faint stiffness in his posture. Recognition. The change was subtle, but it was enough. The man who had been speaking noticed it immediately. "What?" he muttered, glancing sideways. His friend leaned slightly closer, voice low enough that most of the room could not hear it. But Min-Jae did. "Sit down," the man murmured. The words weren't a warning. They were closer to advice. The man frowned.
Why?
The answer came after a brief pause. "That's Kang Min-Jae." For a moment, the name seemed to hang in the air. Across the table, another man's expression shifted as well, his earlier amusement draining into something far more cautious. Even those who didn't know the details had heard the name before. It traveled quietly through business circles and private conversations, never loudly, never officially, but always with the same tone of careful respect. Kang Min-Jae, a businessman to the public. Something else entirely to the people who understood how power really moved through the city. The man who had grabbed Amara's arm straightened slowly in his seat. He looked at Min-Jae again, this time with more attention. "You're serious," he said quietly. Min-Jae didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence itself carried the message. Around them, the restaurant staff had grown noticeably still. Even the manager near the bar had stopped speaking mid-conversation, watching the table with a careful expression. Everyone in the room could feel the shift now. The earlier arrogance at the table had begun to fade, replaced by the uneasy realization that the situation had moved far beyond a simple argument with a waitress. The man cleared his throat, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well," he said, pushing his chair back slightly, "there's no reason for things to get uncomfortable." Min-Jae's gaze remained steady. The man gestured toward the table. "We were just having some fun." Min-Jae looked at him for another quiet moment. Then he said simply, "You're leaving." And this time, no one laughed. For a few seconds after Min-Jae spoke, the table remained frozen. The men looked at one another, each silently calculating the same thing. Pride pulled one way. Reality pulled another. In the end, reality won. Chairs shifted. One of the men reached for his jacket. Another finished the last of his drink in a single swallow, the earlier bravado gone from his posture. The man who had grabbed Amara's arm stood slowly, avoiding her eyes now. "Right," he muttered, forcing a thin smile. No reason to cause trouble. Min-Jae stepped aside just enough to clear their path, but he did not move away from the table. He simply watched. The men gathered their things with quiet efficiency. The confidence they had carried earlier in the evening had drained away, replaced by the careful restraint of people who understood they had pushed their luck far enough. As they passed Min-Jae, one of them nodded stiffly. "Enjoy your evening," he said. Min-Jae did not respond. They walked toward the exit without another word. Only when the front door closed behind them did the tension in the restaurant begin to loosen. Conversations resumed in cautious fragments. Glasses clinked again. The soft music returned to the foreground as if the room itself had decided the disturbance was over. But Min-Jae remained standing for another moment. His gaze moved briefly toward the entrance, where the men had disappeared. Then he reached into his jacket and removed his phone. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. His voice stayed quiet, almost conversational. "Yes," he said. 4 men just left the restaurant on West Halton Street.
A pause. "No."
"They won't return." Another pause. "Make sure of it." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across the room, the manager had finally gathered the courage to approach. His smile was tight. "Mr. Kang," he said carefully, "I apologize for the disturbance. We didn't realize." Min-Jae lifted a hand slightly. The manager stopped speaking. The gesture wasn't aggressive. It simply made it clear the explanation was unnecessary. Your staff handled their work, Min-Jae said calmly. The man nodded quickly.
Yes.
Of course. Min-Jae's gaze drifted briefly across the restaurant floor before settling once more on Amara. She still stood a few steps behind him, the tray in her hands forgotten for the moment. The manager followed his line of sight and cleared his throat awkwardly. We'll make sure she's taken care of. Min-Jae didn't respond to that either. He simply turned back toward his table and walked across the dining room with the same quiet composure he had shown earlier. Within minutes, he was seated again, his glass of wine waiting where he had left it. To most people watching, the moment seemed finished. The men had left. The restaurant had returned to normal. But the consequences of the evening were already unfolding elsewhere, far beyond the dining room. Because men like Kang Min-Jae did not step into situations unless they intended to finish them completely. And once he decided a problem needed to disappear, it usually did. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Conversations resumed, soft and controlled. Glasses clinked against tables. Waiters moved across the floor as if nothing unusual had happened. But for Amara, the room no longer felt the same. She stood near the service station for a moment longer than she should have, the empty tray still resting in her hands. Her arm felt strangely light where the man had held it earlier, as if the absence of his grip had left behind a quiet echo. Around her, the other servers exchanged brief glances. No one spoke about what had happened. They didn't need to. In places like this, people learned quickly when silence was the safest response. Amara finally set the tray down and moved back onto the dining floor. Her steps were steady, her expression composed. Years of practice made it easy to slip back into the role she wore every night.
Smile.
Take orders.
Clear plates.
But something inside her had shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough that the room felt different when she looked at it now. From across the restaurant, Kang Min-Jae remained seated at his table. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't caused a scene. If someone had entered the room only minutes later, they might never have guessed he had been at the center of the entire moment. He looked exactly as he had earlier, calm, controlled, quietly observing the space around him. Amara approached his table with the same professional calm she gave every guest. "Can I bring you anything else this evening?" she asked. Min-Jae looked up. For a brief moment, his attention settled fully on her. Up close, his gaze was steady without being intrusive, thoughtful in a way that made her feel seen in a way she wasn't used to. "No," he said simply. Amara nodded. "Thank you." She turned to leave, expecting the moment to end there, but his voice stopped her. "Amara." She paused, surprised to hear her name. Slowly, she turned back. Min-Jae rose from his chair. Up close, he seemed even taller than she remembered, his presence filling the quiet space around the table without effort. "You handled yourself well," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a sincerity she hadn't expected. Amara hesitated. "It's part of the job," she replied quietly. Min-Jae studied her for a moment, as if weighing that answer against something he understood differently. "Some jobs demand too much silence," he said. Amara didn't know how to respond to that. For years, silence had been the only way she knew how to survive places like this. Min-Jae reached into his jacket and placed a small card on the table. "If you ever decide that silence is no longer the answer," he said calmly, "you can call that number." Amara looked down at the card, but didn't pick it up yet. "What would happen if I did?" she asked. Min-Jae's expression didn't change. "Your life would stop looking like this." The words were not a promise. They were a fact. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Min-Jae stepped past her and walked toward the door. The restaurant continued around them as if nothing had changed. But Amara knew better. Because somewhere between the moment he stepped between her and those men and the moment he placed that card on the table, something in her world had quietly shifted. And deep down, she understood one thing with unsettling clarity. After tonight, her life would never be invisible again.